Sumak Punjai, and welcome back to Nobody Taught Me. I am Serafim Burguyamarca, and this is the final episode of our podcast, which we have called The Inheritance. Over the first three episodes, we followed Victor from the countryside to the classroom to the emotional crossroads of shame and pride. In this last episode, we step back from his individual journey and face the big question. How can Victor teach Quechua to his children and preserve the language? What would it actually take to break the cycle of poor language learning? Let's start with something important. Victor values Quechua. He speaks it with pride. He uses it to connect with people from his community. As we covered in episode 3, he moved from shame to solidarity, and he chose to speak the language. By choosing a language and knowing how to teach it to your children are two very different things. Victor acquired Quechua naturally through connections with his grandmother, through necessity, through his community. Nobody ever taught him its rules. He cannot explain Quechua grammar. He cannot spell words in Quechua. He can read or write, but not in a very formal way. His Quechua lives entirely in his mouth. So when his children were born, he faced the problem that millions of heritage language speakers face. How do you fully pass on a language you never formally learned yourself? He did what his parents did. He spoke some Quechua around the house. He hoped it would transfer. It kind of did. His children understand, but they do not speak it the same way. And Victor recognizes this. The researcher Meryl Swain helps us understand why this happens. Swain studied children in French immersion programs in Canada. These kids heard French all day in school. They understood it fine, but when they spoke, their grammar was off and their vocabulary was limited. Why? Because understanding a language and producing it are completely different cognitive processes. Swain argued that learners need comprehensible output. As we've seen before, learners need to be pushed to deliver messages that are not just understood but are precise, coherent, and appropriate. Victor never really had that in Quechua, and his children could not have had any more exposure. No school assignments, no written tests, no public presentations, and no strategy. Nothing that forces this sort of production. So what happens is they absorb fragments and memorize words instead of acquiring the language. So the policy question becomes, how do you give families like Victor's the tools to actually transmit a heritage language? If we review history, Bolivia has tried this in the past. In 1994, the government launched a massive education reform to implement bilingual intercultural education. The researcher Nancy Hornberger documented the results. The program expanded from about 100 experimental schools to nearly 3,000, reaching 22% of primary students. Graduation rates went up and dropout rates went down. However, on the ground, everything depends on who is in the classroom. At Cayarani School near Cochabamba, a teacher named Berta threw herself into this initiative, decorating her room with handmade Quechua posters. Her students created a class newspaper in Quechua called Yachtacapari, Voice of the People, and a student named Celestino wrote about farmers wanting better prices for their potatoes. All of this was in Quechua, and this pushed output in this school. However, at other schools, the reform materials were barely covered, and learning rates were low. So, Hornberger's conclusion is that top-down policies can open what she calls ideological and implementational spaces, but only local actors fill those spaces. Hornberger also tells the story of Basilia, a 7-year-old girl in a bilingual classroom in Peru. At school, she was very quiet and never spoke. But at home, she was quite the opposite. She spoke Quechua non-stop, showed Hornberger her grandmother's blanket, named every family member, etc. So she wasn't able to talk in school, but found a way to do it at home. That picture captures the problem quite well, but it also captures the missed opportunity because if nobody teaches families how to turn that home energy into structured language development, the Quechua that Basilia speaks at home stays informal forever. The researcher Orlin Luix, who studied believing language policy directly, argues that the country's approach rests on three assumptions. First, that standardizing Quechua is the key to saving it. Second, that historical criteria should guide the standard. And third, that school and literacy are the most important domains. Luix pushes back on all three. She points out that Quechua was the administrative language of the Inca Empire and it was never written or standardized. Standardization can even backfire in cases like this. When the government created correct Quechua, speakers of regional varieties became doubly stigmatized. First for speaking Quechua at all, and then for speaking it wrong. In Ecuador, the researcher Kendall King found that standardization provoked linguistic insecurity. People stopped using Quechua because they were afraid of making newly defined errors. A rural Bolivian teacher put it this way: what is the difference between students having to learn normalized Quechua in order to read and write or having to learn Spanish? Furthermore, the Peruvian Quechua educator Neri Mamani, whom Hornberger interviewed, said it clearly. If we do not use our language, talking on the phone, writing on the internet, riding public transportation, going to the supermarket and speaking Quechua, then who is going to do it? So what does the research tell us? Making conclusions on what we've covered across 4 episodes, the answer points in one direction. Naturalistic acquisition alone gives you conversation, but not full proficiency. And formal instruction alone takes away the language's cultural context, on the other hand. And finally, standardization alone can create new stigma. So the answer is not any of these alone. It is all of them, aimed at the right places. Families and state policy need to create real contexts where students must produce Quechua or other native languages accordingly. The government needs to address the emotional dimension and reduce the shame that blocks the SLA process of investment. And most importantly, it needs to give families the strategies to pass the language on at home. Because wanting to teach your children Quechua and knowing how to do it are not the same thing. Luix ends her analysis with an important reminder. Language death is not a standalone problem but a symptom. She calls language the canary in the coal mine. When the canary stops singing, the problem is not the canary, it is the air quality in the mine. You cannot fix it by reviving the bird, you fix it by changing the conditions that are killing it. This has been Nobody Taught Me. 1 voice, 4 lessons on saving a language. Thank you for listening. If anything in this series resonated with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you speak a heritage language, speak it today, on the phone, at the store, and everywhere. Because languages are part of our identity, and it is our duty to preserve them. From Washington, D.C., this is Serafín Burguía Marca, noga economista político Niscamanta Mancani, Causachum Bolivia, and thanks for listening.